Thank you for joining us, everybody, and welcome to the reality show. I've got Matthew with me today and Daniel, and we may have Razi joining us in just a few minutes. Let's see. Um, the main topic that we've got today, guys, is to do with um, I'm not even sure exactly how to describe it, but the Senate hearing, which went on with the presidents of three top US colleges, where they were kind of dodging the question of whether calling for the genocide of Jews would violate their harassment policies, or one of them said that it would be dependent on context, which caused a lot of outrage. And what it's actually caused one of them, I think it's the one from Harvard, or no, McGill, I think, to resign. And then there's been further calls today for the president of Harvard to resign as well, but I think she's staying strong. And one of the things that we saw is a widespread condemnation of this, I think in a way that we'd all probably find rather encouraging. And there was a commentator whose name I'm completely blanking on now. I don't know if you can remember, Daniel. Was it Fareed something or other?
I should have it somewhere here.
Yeah.
Maybe Matthew.
So, but he's a commentator on one of the kind of mainstream American channels, and he clearly leans left. And he did this kind of monologue to camera talking about
Zakaria.
There we go, Fareed Zakaria. This editorial broadcast piece talking about how terrible this was, and I think we thought this was rather encouraging and impressive. So we're going to talk about that today, and broadly about the hearing as well. So Daniel, what did you think about Fareed Zakaria's piece and about this general story?
So he made many really nice. I'm just trying to pull up what he said. Yeah, I mean the first thing that really was nice to hear was American universities have been neglecting a core focus on excellence in order to pursue a variety of agendas, many of them clustered around diversity and inclusion. And that was really nice to hear. But of course, he is still someone who I think we would consider more on the left. So when he mentioned diversity and inclusion, he also mentioned it started with the best of intention. So you can see while he still maybe believes in these ideas, he still has this, which is always nice to hear, that with a lot of these people, they still have some core principles. They still have some certain view of the world that gives them a bit better perspective when something goes real crazy. I mean, even a couple days ago, we talked about Bernie Sanders, who, for again, all his faults, he's on the left, all basically his policies, he, for example, defends Israel's right to defend itself, which was, again, really nice to see. So it's really nice, yeah, basically to see that we still have this sort of principled people, even maybe on I guess we would consider the opposite side of the aisle. We still have these principled people on the other side, which makes me, I was about to, yeah, it's just really nice to see. I have something else to say, but let's go to Matthew first.
Sure, Matthew, what did you think?
Well, yeah, I mean it's interesting what's happening, and that we are getting these, albeit few, we are getting these commentators on who are more on the left, who seem to be starting to break ranks. Because I mean, as in terms of the more general sort of phenomena of what's happening, it seems almost like the liberal principles that were used to argue for diversity and inclusiveness over the last few years seem almost to be getting turned in on themselves, and that they're sort of being used to argue for ideas which actually are not diverse and not inclusive, and are actually about excluding and essentially dehumanizing certain groups of people. So, you know, it's gone from supporting sort of freedom of religion to everyone essentially trying to almost justify or at least turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism and prejudice against the Jews and against Israel.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting thing how, I guess, in the last few years, there's almost been the politicization of racism, in the sense that the different political wings kind of have their own pet racism, or at least it's perceived that way. So, for example, I think people on the left are much more likely to be upset and agitated by racism towards black people, for example, than people on the right are. People on the right are much more likely, I would expect, to be kind of defensive and to have to take a lot more evidence to be convinced by it, whereas people on the left would be much more willing to kind of go with claims about that. And then people on the right, I think, would be much more likely to be sensitive to anti-Semitism, whereas people on the left almost seem a bit suspicious to it. And there's a book I really want to recommend. It's called Jews Don't Count by David Baddiel, who's a comedian. If anyone wants to read about how anti-Semitism plays out in relation to the left, I think that's a fantastic book. It's only about 100 pages. And David Baddiel is a comedian in the UK, for anyone who's from outside the UK. And he basically, in the book, just documents his experiences with advocating, I guess, that people take anti-Semitism more seriously. And he considers himself a progressive leftist, and basically documenting his experiences with his own party, in a sense, and how they react against it, and all these kind of double standards. And what he basically thinks is that there's been this politicization of anti-Semitism where people on the left are suspicious of it because they view it as the right-wing kind of racism. It's what people on the right are concerned about. So if you're complaining about anti-Semitism, there's a kind of suspicion about you, and all this kind of thing. And how, interestingly, for someone on the left, he viewed some of the anti-Semitism that's coming from the left as being connected to their anti-capitalism, which I think there's a lot of merit to. There's something we can dig into there, where in a sense they rely on anti-Semitic stereotypes of being, overly wealthy and powerful and controlling things, and that connects to their anti-capitalist views, or it connects to their anti-capitalist views in the sense that they're more likely to kind of see. So, for example, when Jeremy Corbyn famously retweeted this mural that was viewed as anti-Semitic, which contained anti-Semitic depictions of Jews, it was also an anti-capitalist mural, and he kind of saw the anti-capitalism in it rather than the anti-Semitism, and so he kind of blanked that out. So I think that's really interesting, and so it's encouraging to see, I guess, that there are people on the left who aren't quite like David Baddiel, the people David Baddiel is faulting. That there is this guy whose name I've completely forgotten again, Fareed, that guy, the commentator who did the piece. It was encouraging.
Fareed Zakaria.
There we go, Fareed Zakaria. It was encouraging to see that he could articulate the case quite well, because there is no reason why anti-Semitism should be politicized. It shouldn't be one wing thinks that anti-Semitism is completely outrageous and one wing is kind of like suspicious of that. So I think that was very good. Daniel, you said you had something else that you thought about the piece. What else did you think?
So just to mention, just to comment on something you mentioned at the end, this sort of, almost like putting anti-Semitism into context. Like whenever someone talks about anti-Semitism, specifically on the left, it's always, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. They try to like make a distinction, which, I mean, you could argue there is a distinction, but oftentimes what they mean by anti-Zionism is just being anti-Israel, which oftentimes is just straight up anti-Semitism. But something else I wanted to comment on is something really, I don't think it's unique about objectivism. I think it might be unique about objectivism since, we believe it is the right philosophy. It basically corresponds to the reality. So if you apply objectivist principles correctly, and if there are people out there who are not objectivists, but are trying to basically sort of implicitly implied by responding to reality by using a correct epistemology, oftentimes they will arrive to the same conclusions we do. We just have this sort of cheat book, which makes it easier for us. But if they are honest, if they are using their reason properly, they will oftentimes arrive to the same conclusion, which is always nice to see, that we don't have to basically explicitly share the philosophy. If we are all trying to reach the truth, we will reach the same thing, even if we don't straight up use philosophy. I'm wondering what you guys think about it, because I see Matthew somewhat shaking his head, and I'm not sure.
I wasn't shaking my head to disagree with you. I got distracted by something in the room. That's all.
Fair enough. I mean, I think objectivism is a leg up in a huge number of things, but it is a leg up in these things. And it's important. There's so many, I guess, philosophical issues which apply to these things. One of them is, I guess, the importance of thinking in principle, which is what the people on the left who are not like Fareed Zakaria are doing, which is they consider themselves these great anti-racists and that they're against prejudice everywhere, but they aren't really against racism in principle. And so when you get to anti-Semitism, they can often entertain the very things which in other cases they would condemn. So they're failing to think in principle, and that's one of the many important kind of leg ups that objectivism can give you.
If I can quickly comment on that, on the anti-racism part, and it was and now I forgot his name. Fareed Zakaria even mentioned it in his when he was talking about, and we talked about this, I think it was a couple of months ago, when the Supreme Court eliminated affirmative action, and a lot of colleges responded by it, wanted to respond to it by basically eliminating SATs to remove pretty much any objective value that you could judge the, as he called it, the excellency of the students, and base it purely on just the racial criteria or racial quotas. And one more thing I wanted to mention is I think there is like this correlation between sort of this anti-racism and anti-Semitism, because when they claim to be anti-racist, it's oftentimes being racist towards the more, let's say, well-off races, such as when it comes to colleges, such as Asians, in favor of the maybe less well-off races, which like the Black community.
For sure. Well, and that's something that David Baddiel ends up talking about, why they end up kind of joining in anti-Semitic stereotypes is because they perceive, well, Jewish people are typically well off or in some way, and therefore they're kind of resented by people on the left as being the kind of enemy capitalist class, right? I was going to say something against what you just said, but I've completely forgotten it now. So one of the other things we were considering about this is this a sign that this view could spread in the left in general? Because basically the left has been, regarding the anti-Semitism here, really supporting the enemy. Whereas, as we say, it shouldn't be a political partisan issue. Anti-Semitism should very clearly be able to be seen as wrong by any political party or any political wing. And so given that Fareed Zakaria has come out and said this, and that there's been widespread condemnation, do you think that we'll see a change in people's attitudes towards Israel and recognize the anti-Semitism that's going on there? Or do you think we'll see a wider condemnation of the anti-Semitism, the pro-Palestine marches that we see going on? So do you think people's attitudes are really going to change, or is this a flash in the pan, do you think? Matthew, we'll come to you and then we'll go to Daniel.
Well, I'd like to think that the marches and whatnot are a sort of flash in the pan, or at least the blatantly sort of anti-Semitic elements of them are a flash in the pan. I mean, just purely thinking of British politics for a moment, the Labour Party clearly have a problem and have done for a number of years. And I'm actually quite impressed with Keir Starmer in that he hasn't sort of buckled to all of these calls to support an immediate ceasefire. He has sort of maintained the line that yes, civilian casualties should be minimised, but Israel has the right to essentially defend themselves and try to get rid of this threat. And he has had a bit of a sort of mutiny going on in the Labour Party by the sounds of things as a result of taking that stand. But which way things are going to go, well, I would like to think the Starmers and the Zakarias are going to sort of win out on the left, but I wouldn't bet on it at this point.
Mm. And Daniel, what do you think that we'll see a kind of wider spread condemnation of anti-Semitism from the left, or do you think this is kind of a one-off?
I think I'm not too optimistic. I think even with people like that, it's still relative what I would call like a moderate left position, like kind of speaking out against anti-Semitism, or being horrified by what's happening at the universities that we saw specifically with the committee hearing. Because we've seen, I think it was the University of Pennsylvania, the president there resigned, and I'm not sure here, either MIT or Harvard teachers pretty much came up in support of the president. So we still see at the extremes. I'm not sure how much is it actually gonna change. We see the same thing. I think it was in the news today that the Joe Biden's staff is demanding ceasefire. They're protesting in front of the White House. So I think it's still sort of like a more of a moderate position, and I'm not sure if it's gonna get to maybe the more radical parts. So the only solution really is to hope for some sort of de-radicalization of the left, which I'm not sure if we'll ever see that.
Sure. I guess I also basically don't know. So I think it's really encouraging that you see Fareed Zakaria, I got the name this time, doing a broadcast like this, basically because when you get intellectual leaders like this, and he's maybe not like a professor, but he's a spokesperson who's espousing this kind of view that people will watch and people will dwell on what he's said. When you get someone like him deviating from the norm in this way, it makes it more acceptable for people on the left to echo that kind of opinion, right? Because it becomes more normal. So that's encouraging, and I completely agree with everything you guys have said about that. So there's, I guess, potential there, but I guess the way that I feel more cynical is, I guess it relates back to what I've said already about the way that the left is more concerned with their anti-capitalism than their anti-Semitism. And aside from the David Baddiel book, there was an example I saw today, which was an interview done a number of years ago in GQ magazine with Rachel Riley, who, I think we've mentioned Rachel Riley before, but she's a celebrity in the UK who hosts Countdown, and Cats does Countdown, which is this game show basically. And she's become very well known and outspoken, I'd say, in the last 6 years or so, against speaking out against anti-Semitism, and got a lot of harassment basically directed at her online when she spoke out against Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party, for what she perceived to be kind of him either supporting anti-Semitism, supporting anti-Semitic people, or giving it a free pass, basically. And she's been very outspoken about that. She's been very outspoken about anti-Semitism in the UK since the 7th of October, and so on and so forth. And this interview was from maybe 4 years ago or something, where she's being interviewed by Alistair Campbell, who does all the interviews for GQ. And he's asking her about this and why she kind of feels this way. And she's clearly very agitated and is very morally outraged about the idea that Jeremy Corbyn is giving a free pass to anti-Semites in various respects. And he, whilst paying lip service to the idea of course that's terrible, of course you should be outraged by that, he asks her whether she would vote Conservative. And she says in the next election, yes, because I wouldn't want Corbyn to be leader, because this was, there was a chance of that. And he's clearly very bothered by this and keeps asking her whether in principle she's a Conservative or not. And I think what that interaction suggested is this broader trend. He's more bothered by the fact that she would vote Conservative, and so that's the kind of anti-capitalism. He's more concerned by that than he is by the fact that she's concerned about anti-Semitism, and he can't fully get his head around it. And so whilst I didn't view him there as being outwardly anti-Semitic in the sense that he has an animus in his mind against Jews, he's not as bothered by that as he is by the fact that she's willing to vote for a right-wing party. And so that, I think, is why to bring it all the way back around, why I'm a bit skeptical about the potential for this to spread amongst the left, because there's this kind of, I guess you'd call it maybe a cognitive bias in some way. Like they have a prejudice far more to caring about capitalism than other things. And as much as the better people on the left might care about anti-Semitism, when push comes to shove, they'll care about capital, like their anti-capitalism more. And to the extent that they are able to conflate anti-capitalism with anti-Semitic tropes as well, and all this kind of stuff that David Baddiel ends up talking about, it stops them being able to fully combat anti-Semitism, which is why we see it spread on the British left. And of course, given that, that's why we think it's encouraging that Fareed Zakaria has done this. But that's ultimately why I don't know. But I hope so. I hope that it ends up spreading. But let's talk a little bit, I guess, about the initial incident.
Maybe I want to comment on something before that, because you talked about if this maybe more fighting against anti-Semitism views would spread to the left. I think ultimately it's similar to the ethics of altruism. As long as there are ethics of altruism, the more consistent ones will have the moral superiority. And I think it's very similar here. Like at the core of the left is anti-capitalism, and as long as you have this, they will always have a bias against sort of anyone who is in power. So that's why they focus on billionaires. That's why they used to focus on millionaires, but now it's billionaires. And I think this spreads towards maybe certain groups that seem to have more power. So I think this is where the more of an anti-white racism might be coming from. And I think even anti-Semitism might be closely related to anti-capitalism, basically.
Some of the objection as well that David Baddiel speaks about is about the idea of whether that people on the left perceive Jews as being white. And of course, a Jewish person, in the sense of someone who's religiously Jewish, can be any skin color. That's completely irrelevant. But what was interesting about his point is that, of course, in the minds of anti-Semites on the right, like Nazis, Jews aren't white at all. That, you know, if you're a white supremacist and you hate Jews, you want to cast Jews out from your kind of group. But people on the left then flip it around, and they want to associate Jewish people with the tropes of white privilege and all this kind of stuff, which also feeds into it. And I just thought of that because of what you said. But Matthew, did you have something to say?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking, I guess the sort of association of Judaism and the world of business and capitalism, actually, that's been around for quite a while. I mean, you know, way back in one of Shakespeare's plays, The Merchant of Venice, one of the characters, Shylock, is expressly Jewish, is a moneylender, and he's without giving the whole thing away for anyone who's not familiar with it, essentially he's portrayed somewhat malevolently because he is trying to collect on a debt with interest owed him by one of the other characters. And even, you know, it's hard to sort of either read the script or indeed watch the play without getting the impression that he's intended as the sort of villain of the piece, if I can put it in that way.
For sure. And I mean, to be fair, I think given that it's 400 years old, if we can't talk about spoilers now, when can we? But no, you're right. Absolutely, Shylock definitely partakes in those kind of stereotypes, and even worse than that, Shakespeare's contemporary Christopher Marlowe has his play The Jew of Malta, which is the main character in that, Barabbas. It literally poisons wells and does all of this stereotypical stuff, right? So it's awful. And I think may have some. Go on, sorry.
No, I thought you were going to the next topic. I just want to jump in before that.
Go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to mention we have a super chat from Jonathan Honing. Thank you so much. 1999. And we have a member comment from Bonnie. She's saying, if we are trying to promote individualism, it's important to not assume that every anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas. Then also Willful Thinker mentioned, can we describe what anti-Zionism that isn't anti-Semitism looks like? Would you guys like to comment on it? Or how would you even define Zionism?
So I would say that what Zionism is the position that you believe you believe in the creation of a homeland explicitly for Jewish people. I think that's a fair description of the position. Now, I think, to be honest, I'm not a Zionist. I don't think that would be my aim. Now, I don't think I'm in favor of Israel. So you could say I'm pro-Israel, but I'm not in favor of Zionism, if that makes sense. The reason why I think Israel is a good country is because Israel is fundamentally free, protects rights, all the kind of things that objectivists like. Israel's fundamentally doing that, and is the best representative of that in the region of the world in which it is. I'm not in favor of Israel just because it's founded with the intention of being a Jewish state. I don't think any state should be founded with the intention of favoring one ethnic religious group over another. So even though I think someone like Theodor Herzl, he's not the founder of the Zionist movement, but he's the kind of one of the big figureheads of it in the late 19th century, whose work ultimately leads to the founding of Israel a few decades after his death. Even though I think he's quite admirable in lots of ways, I think he has a positive element. He famously writes an essay called The Judenstaat, the Jewish state, where he advocates for this idea. And it mixes in a kind of collectivist premise, really, the idea that the state is for a certain group. Part of the reason why we praise Israel, for example, is that not only are Jews able to live there freely and prosperously and be protected, but Arabs are able to do that as well. And that's an example for the whole region. Both groups should be able to live in any one country and fundamentally be free and have their rights respected. So I think Zionism is effectively on a false premise. And so I think the question was, what would anti-Zionism that's not anti-Semitic look like? Although I don't know if I suppose maybe you could express my position as anti-Zionism, but maybe what I've just said is anti-Zionism, which I don't think is anti-Semitic. But what was Gail's question, Daniel? Sorry, it's just slipped my mind.
Gail didn't ask. Well, there were two questions. No, actually, what is and how does anti-Zionism that isn't anti-Semitism look like?
Okay, so I think it's basically what I just said. I don't know if you agree, but
so I've been thinking about it because ultimately I'd say I disagree with the idea that there should be like a state just for a certain ethnic ethnical culture or something. But I think there is something unique about Zionism and Israel because Jews have been persecuted in pretty much every country they have been in. So as long as that is the case, I think you could even it will be interesting to hear what Ayn Rand said if she would call herself a Zionist, and I'm not sure if anyone maybe in the chat knows if she ever commented on it. But I think you could make the case, definitely not in the sense that they should have like some special privileges, or in a Zionist state only Jews should have a citizenship, and Israel is not that. A lot of non-Jews have full rights, are fully free. The main thing that would be basically considered Zionism is the fact that they want to secure the sort of majority of the Jews. I think there is a certain part of it that's very problematic, but I think you could still make a good case for Zionism. That's why if someone calls themselves an anti-Zionist, I think they're explicitly against a Jewish state. So I don't think you can be anti-Zionist but pro-Israel.
Matthew, what do you think about this issue?
Well, I agree with what what you guys were saying. I mean, the reason I support Israel is because it's the most sort of free and westernized country in the Middle East. In terms of should the Jews have their own homeland, well, I can understand why they feel the need to have their own homeland, given the centuries of persecution just about everywhere. And I can understand why they all were already. Then let's remember they were all already moving to that part of the world before Israel was founded as a Jewish state. I can understand why they all were going to that particular part of the world, given the sort of historic link with that area and them considering it their homeland. Am I a Zionist? I don't know is the answer, because in terms of the religious aspect of it, that's really neither here nor there for me. Just thinking back to before October the 7th, before all of this started, there was issues in Israel, domestically within Israel, because the government were trying to, as far as I remember it, were doing things that were favoured by not necessarily Netanyahu's own party, but the kind of religious extremist parties that he's allied with. And a lot of the more secular Israelis were actually out protesting, opposing some of the changes they were going to make. So even within Israeli society, there was actually this kind of excuse me. There was almost a tension between the very religious Orthodox Jewish elements and the more secular elements who are sort of ethnically Jewish, I guess is the term, but who are actually quite secular and westernized in how they're living their lives. So I guess it depends how you want to define Zionism. I mean, if you're defining it in religious terms, I would reject that, because I reject the religious basis of it.
Yes, and
sorry, probably made my position sound a lot more complicated than it is. There, sorry.
No, it's okay. No, I mean, we always want the great thing for a podcast is to always, explain. So I think that's the main thing. I think I still am I an anti-Zionist? It's a vague kind of question, I guess, in the sense that I agree with Daniel that when people call themselves anti-Zionists, I guess that generally makes me a bit suspicious. Of course, one of the vague things about this is people who complain about Zionism cannot, although they might not always be anti-Semitic, they can be anti-Semitic, and that Zionists can, for people on the far right, for example, can just be a kind of a way of saying Jewish without saying Jewish. So they can complain about the Zionist influence on the US government or something like that. And what they're really doing is they're repeating the kind of conspiracy theory that Jews are controlling the US government and all this kind of stuff, right? So I guess I would be suspicious of people who are anti-Zionist sometimes, kind of like that. But then even if, because basically I think the kind of case you made, Daniel, was that the case for a Jewish homeland is very understandable given the history and given the context of the Second World War. I think that's definitely true. And it's also, I guess, there's a way in which you could see it as understandable given that in the region that we now call Israel, which was under the British mandate from in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, there was tremendous, basically, ethnic violence, I guess you'd call it, between the Arabs and the Jewish groups who were there, which basically the British mandate never managed to get under control. So when they withdraw, there's instant outbreak of violence, and then obviously an invasion from the other Arab countries. And so part of the reason why you want to create a Jewish state there is because you're not able to resolve that violence. But then, again, it is kind of giving credence, one, to the racist premise underneath that violence that Jews and Arabs can't live in comity together, that there is something different about them. And then also, I still think there's a collectivist kind of premise in it. So even though I guess, especially for people who must have lived through the Second World War and who would have been there when the news of the Holocaust was first kind of released to the world, it must have been very understandable to desire to create a Jewish state. I still think there's something flawed about it in principle. So I guess that's why I wouldn't describe myself as a Zionist, although I would think of myself as being pro-Israel.
So one thing I'd maybe say on this is that there's never a statement that's like in a vacuum. There's always a certain amount of context. So while saying something like even Free Palestine, let's say, might not necessarily be anti-Semitic, when you go to the streets on October 7th and you chant it on streets, I'm sort of suspicious. And even when this war is still happening, if you call yourself an anti-Zionist while Israel is actively in war, I'm again suspicious of what do you exactly mean by that. And maybe to relate it a bit to Ayn Rand, you know, she would never describe herself as Jewish, but if she heard any anti-Semitic statements while she is in the presence, she would say she would consider herself Jewish. And I think if I ever called myself a Zionist, I think it would be a similar principle basically behind it. I would only call myself a Zionist in the presence of anti-Zionists just because I'm suspicious of what do they mean.
Sure, I completely see what you're saying. I think you still before the Zionist position existed before the Second World War, right? And so when it's originally put forward by the Zionist movement or by Theodor Herzl, for example, there still is, like, if I were there, I'm trying to think when on earth he published that essay. I want to say it's in the 1890s. If I were there when it first is published and I were reading it, I think if you were Ayn Rand or if we were just individualists, you know, like us, I think you would read it and you'd think there's a ethnic collectivist premise in this. So there's a flaw principally in this position. So even then, once you get the very understandable historical context, why people will be more amenable to the idea of creating a Jewish state after the Second World War, I still think in principle there's still something wrong. So I completely hear what you're saying. I just think because there's that essential problem, that's why I couldn't call myself a Zionist. So yeah, I don't know, but like I completely hear what you're saying, and I also, whenever people complain about Zionism, it does set my teeth on edge, I guess, or put me on edge a little bit. Anything else to say, guys, on this? No? Okay. Do we have any other topics to move on to, or?
No, I don't think so.
No? Okay, fair enough. Shall we wrap the show up then? Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, everyone. Leave a comment. Tell us what you think about Zionism and whether you think you can be pro-Israel but anti-Zionist. But thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks for joining me, Daniel and Matthew. And we'll be back tomorrow for the reality show. Thank you so much.